Well, thanks very much, President, and good morning to everybody. It's a highlight for me as well to be with you this morning. So thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity. And as you indicated, Dave, what I would intend to do is to speak relatively briefly, perhaps 15 minutes or so, to leave us time to have a conversation and for you to raise the issues which are most of interest to you, because there's an enormous number of things that we could talk about. Thank you for the kind presentation too, Dave. You didn't mention I started my trade union life at the TUC, your organisation. There were 12 million members when I left the TUC. I don't know what you've done with them all since I've left. There's a few less today, but that's perhaps a symptom of some of the issues that we're here to talk about today. Can I also, just on a personal note, say my relationship with the PSI has been a very long one. I've worked with the PSI in many capacities over many years. And for most of that time, it was Hans Engelberts who was the leader of your organisation. And I can't start this presentation without saying a word in tribute to Hans. He was a great leader of the PSI, a great trade union internationalist, and a great friend of this organisation, the ILO, and of me personally. So we will certainly miss him. Now, let me take a very broad sort of approach to what I think are some of the key issues facing the International Labour Organization at this time. And if they're facing our organisation, I would suggest they're also confronting trade unions in your different countries. I think we share an agenda and we need to construct the right agenda together to respond to the challenges that we face. And I have to say, for the most part, the bad news outweighs the good news. We've got some very tough fights on our hands. I'll start with what I know you've already been discussing, so I'm only going to go through it really very quickly. This question of the right to strike. Now, I've seen from your background documents that you've got a very clear knowledge and understanding of the course of events, I would say since 2012, June 2012 in particular, when the employers sort of activated an agenda that they've had for a very long time. This issue has been around, not coincidentally, since the end of the Cold War, and you can do some calculations around that. But from 2012, the employers group here actively went on the offensive to say that they do not agree any longer with the ILO's established understanding of the right to strike, as we've always understood to be contained in our key convention, Convention 87. And as a consequence of that argument, which was grounded very, very much on legalistic arguments here in the ILO, they didn't go into the politics or the merits of the right to strike, just a very legal argument to say there is no legal evidence to suggest that Convention 87, which makes no explicit reference to the right to strike, actually implies a right to strike. This was a challenge to the accumulated jurisprudence of the organisation over half a century, and had the effect of actually bringing our supervisory mechanisms, particularly the ILO Conference Committee on Standards, grinding more or less to a halt, or at least to severely impede its work. Now, I don't want to underestimate the importance of the triggering issue. The right to strike is of fundamental importance. I don't have to say that to this audience. But it also created something of an existential problem for the ILO, because an ILO whose standards supervisory system does not work or does not command the support of its tripartite constituency is an ILO which is basically denuded of its essential means of action. Enormously important. So I have to say, and I know that interpretations and views around this may diverge, that the agreement that was finally reached by our governing body last March, which I think you've been through in terms of its content, an agreement between the employers and workers group, which actually permits the ILO's supervisory system to return, to actually operate again. And my hope is that the conference committee that starts its work next week here in Geneva will complete its work, was very good news. The question, I think, is, does the agreement that was struck between the workers and employers group constitute a definitive solution to the issues at hand, or is it a truce is it an agreement to disagree and to carry on working? And I think there are arguments, and I can take questions on this, I think there are arguments that go in both directions there. And in the end, it will only be the fullness of time that will instruct us as to whether we've actually settled this problem or postponed it. I could say a great deal more. I think we will all know a great deal more if the Conference Committee on Standards completes its work in the next 2 weeks satisfactorily. Let's see. Now, beyond the right to strike, let's just take a quick snapshot at what is happening in the world of work today. First, obvious point, we are seeing record rates of unemployment in the world. Unemployment which is over 200 million in the world. And despite everything that has been said about global recovery of the economy, the global employment rate which is going to continue to increase. It is not going down, it is continuing to increase. And our projections for the future are that process under current growth trends will continue. So we cannot look to any substantive improvement in the overall employment situation, rather the reverse. And at current trend rates, the global economy is now growing more slowly than it used to pre-crisis, when we already had problems. We have to create 40 million jobs every year in the global economy, 40 million, just to absorb newcomers to the labour market. And at the current rate of progress, the global economy is incapable of doing that. So, a permanent crisis of unemployment on current trends. It's the first thing to keep in your minds. Secondly, what's actually happening to jobs, those who have a job? We released our flagship report at the beginning of this week, last week, excuse me, the World Economic and Social Employment and Social Outlook, which was dedicated to the changing nature of jobs. And I can see faces from all across the world, developing, emerging, industrialized countries here. And what does our report show? Well, firstly, it shows that only about half of workers in the world are in an employer-employee relationship. 60% of the world's workers work without a written contract. And that if 50% of people are in an employer-employee relationship, only below 25% of working people now work in what we've always thought of as the standard employment situation, full-time, permanent contract. 1 in 4 people. We're seeing continued expansion, to some extent accelerated by the crisis, of part-time work, of temporary work, contract arrangements, all of the things that you're familiar with. And again, against this background of high and sustained unemployment, we have a transformation of the nature of employment. And I think that leads us to have to ask some rather important questions about the future of work, the future of the employment relationship. And here I just want to make use of the initiatives that the ILO has launched with a view to its own centenary. Our centenary comes up in 2019. This is the oldest organisation of the international system. Just to enumerate what I think are some of the key issues we have to look at. I've suggested 7, we call them centenary initiatives for the ILO, to be pursued up to 2019. Some of them have to do with our internal business, and I'm not going to bother you with them. But one of them is precisely a future of work initiative, a process which over the next 4 years should involve the ILO's tripartite constituents, but also people beyond our tripartite constituency, academics, think tanks, personalities, journalists, thinkers, philosophers, in a really in-depth reflection about where our world of work is heading. And I'm suggesting to our conference in this report, it's only a very, very short report, you can read it at lunchtime, it's really easy to do. I'm suggesting a process which involves 4 conversations. It's a bit Blairite that day, but 4 conversations. 1 on work and society. I think it is time to have a fundamental think about the role of work in our societies. Yes, it's about earning a living, enabling you to maintain a certain standard of living. But it's also about being a part of society. It's about contributing to society. It's about social integration. It's about a whole series of things which sometimes we dismiss as sort of peripheral or soft issues. And I want to put it to you, given the state of our societies and the way that the evolution of work is impacting on our societies, we need to take these issues seriously and take this new look at them. The second conversation, and it's an absolutely inevitable conversation, is about where the jobs of the future are coming from. We tend to give some rather easy answers to that. We say, well, the green economy has tremendous potential. The care economy has tremendous potential. So it does. But I'm not happy at providing those as sort of magic silver bullet solutions to the future of employment. There's a much more fundamental question to be asked. And that is our global economy, as currently arranged and under the control of the policy instruments that we currently use, capable of generating those 40 million jobs a year, 600 million jobs by 2030, that we need if we are seriously to approach this established goal of full employment in the global economy. Either we say no and we abandon that full employment goal, and I would reject that, or we ask ourselves the question, do current arrangements, current policy instruments give us a chance of getting there, or do we have to fundamentally rearrange our approach to employment? Do we have to think about sharing employment and organising income in a different way? That income should not only be from the work that you do, but from guaranteed social incomes that come from other sources, which brings the state into play. Big questions. And people are talking about these things. People are talking about these things. But we're, as trade unionists and the ILO, we're used to dealing with the problems that are before our noses today, the specific issues that require an answer today. Well, our centenary 4 or 5 years down the road gives us a chance to take a longer look at whether current labour market conditions, the impact of demography, the impact of technology, and by the way, if you look at the thinkers on technology, you get everybody, you get everything you want to hear, from a sort of apocalyptic end of work analysis to a much more positive technologist analysis, which says that the unfurling revolution of technological innovation is going to actually boost the world of work in ways which we would all approve of. That's the second conversation. And there's a lot more to be said about it, because where jobs are created matters a lot as well. We know that there will be shortage of workers in some countries and excesses in others. And we know that the equalizer in that equation is migration, and we know all of the problems around migration in the world today, and I know you're looking at that as well. That's got to go into the equation. The third conversation is about the organisation of work and production, the future of the enterprise. Now, I'm speaking to a public sector audience here and I'm aware of it, but there is a lot of things going on in the private sector which would lead one to believe that the classic enterprise is currently constituted, permanent, anchored nationally, even if multinational in operation, with a directly contracted workforce, is actually going out of fashion. It's actually disappearing. You have major international producers today who have very few direct employees, very, very few, and they are sourcing along global production lines, which probably make our established processes of regulation, national laws trying to deal with international actors, largely inadequate. And we feel that very strongly at the ILO. The ILO has a system of regulation based on member states ratifying conventions and applying them at the national level. We've got this transversal situation now of global supply lines, which we estimate now employ 1 in every 5 workers in the world, cutting entirely across those issues. Very much, I would suggest, as the tax issues which you're discussing here cut across the ability of national government to basically get the tax revenues that they need to make the state work and your sectors operate as they should. And that takes me to the last conversation, which is about the governance of work. You know, we've lived in an era, most of us have worked in trade unions in an era when the overriding philosophy has been increasingly let the market take its course, get out of the way, state regulation is an impediment, a burden. You know that discourse better than me. I'm sure you're dealing with it every day. So what is our proper attitude towards the governance of work? What is the role of the state? What is the role of national and international regulation? Can we look to the international community to take international regulation of labour markets seriously? It's not at all evident to me that we can. And what about this new burgeoning sector of corporate social responsibility? There is a widening body of thought which thinks that governance of work should be put into private hands. It should be for private enterprises to declare their own voluntary governance systems, and it's true, to be held accountable to them through improved transparency, sort of a privatisation of regulation, if you like. Now, those are some of the things that the ILO is thinking about as we head towards our centenary. I just want to relate that to what's going on in the international system, of which, of course, the ILO is a part. This is part of the UN system. And again, this relates very closely to the issues you're looking at and the papers that you have before you. The United Nations is billing 2015 as the year of global action. From Sendai, from the Disaster Resilience Conference, through to the Financing for Development Conference in Addis Ababa in July, through to the setting of the post-2015 development agenda by the United Nations General Assembly in New York in September, and the Climate Change Conference in Paris in December. A year for global action, that's how we're billing it. Now, I think there is enormous opportunity in these events and enormous responsibilities. The next step is at Addis Ababa in July. And the question is, what can we expect from Addis? Now, it's not a pledging conference. It's not a conference where governments are going to put money on the table or anybody else. It's a political conference where a blueprint for raising the finance for development is going to be hammered out, at least we hope so. And there are clearly three elements to where the money, the financing is going to come from. One is the traditional and familiar source of overseas development assistance, that 0.7 target that so few of our countries have reached. And the bad news there is that with the current state of public finances and government attitudes towards those finances, I think it's unreasonable to think that that area of financing is going to expand in any significant way. Indeed, if we can hold it where it is today, we'd probably be happy about it. There's a big challenge here, which in my view is fundamental but ignored, which is responsibilities for ODA, responsibilities is not being assumed by the emerging countries which should be taking responsibility, the Brazils, the Chinas of this world. China still regards itself as a developing country and therefore on the other side of the equation. The second pool of resources potentially is domestic resources. States need to be able to raise their own resources for development, and I think to this audience this particularly means tax collection. And we know all of the problems about base erosion and profit shifting, the capacity of the state to raise its own resources in ways which are both equitable in terms of the tax burden on different actors and not susceptible to the international gaming which international actors are all too happy to engage in to avoid their responsibilities. And then the third area that's going to be talked about, and this is one you're going to love, is the leveraging of private finance. And I know what you think about PPPs. I don't know if you're going to be in. I don't know if you're going to be in Addis Ababa, but there is a lot of conversations of different types. It's complex, of how, as the saying goes from the IMF and the World Bank, private finance can be levered to promote the development agenda we want to see put in place. So Addis Ababa matters in July. And then we go to New York in September for this post-2015 development agenda. And here I think there's some good news. The ILO and our governing bodies and our constituents, including the workers' group, are very happy with the state of the written agenda as it currently stands and is unlikely to be much modified before adoption in September. We've got specific goals around decent work and full employment and productive employment. Partly, people like to tell me that's down to good lobbying by the ILO. We did mobilise well around this. I prefer to think it's because the world has woken up to the idea that jobs are the way out of poverty and into development. We've got a goal around social protection linked to poverty and a great deal else. Now, it can always be improved. Anything you get can always be better. But on paper, this is a good agenda for the ILO. I'd like to suggest it's a good agenda for trade unions. I think the problem is elsewhere. The problem is whether or not the world will take this agenda seriously. Now, whatever their shortcomings, the world did take the Millennium Development Goals seriously. Not all of those goals were attained, but the world mobilized, public opinion mobilized around the MDGs. And to some extent, finance and public policy mobilized around the MDGs. My worry for the post-2015 agenda is the world has not woken up to this agenda, the world is not engaged, there is not real political push behind this agenda. And I think all of us can contribute to try to give it more substance and more traction. And then the last agenda will be the climate change conference in Paris at the end of the year. And, you know, this is a world of work issue. There was a time when we thought we had to make a choice between saving the planet or promoting employment. I presided over an organisation, a trade union organisation, which was unable to endorse the Kyoto Protocol, precisely for that reason. There were trade union centres in the world who felt that the Kyoto Protocol was damaging to employment interests. We've got over that one. We've got over that one. We now understand, and I think that the trade union movement would subscribe to the idea that what we need to work upon is a just transition to a sustainable future, a low-carbon productive future, which is proactive and pro-positive for employment creation. And it's not a dream, it's not a utopia, it's not trying to square a circle. It is absolutely doable. There is an enormous potential in the green economy, but it does not happen automatically. And we have to get, I think, policymakers gathering in Paris to take that just employment transition on board in their negotiating processes. And that is the reason why the high point of our conference, which starts next week, the 11th of June, with 3 heads of state in attendance, we hope that the President of France will be there, is dedicated to the world of work and climate change, to make a reality of that connection and to focus attention around it. Now, that is the future of work stuff that we're doing. We're accompanying that with a number of other initiatives. The Women at Work initiative. We're still in a world where the gender pay gap is around 23%. And as one of my colleagues says, it's like if you still work a 5-day week, it's like women being paid 4 days, but you don't see women knocking off on Thursday evening and coming back on Monday morning. Something wrong with that. Women's participation rates are still 26 percentage points below those of men. The G20 has set some ambitions around reducing that, but we have a hell of a long way to go. There is no obvious, long-term, unambiguous movement towards equality, despite half a century of equality legislation and activism. We've got a long way to go there. We have a green initiative, which I've already referred to. We have an end of poverty initiative, bearing in mind that the post-2015 development agenda is about the elimination of extreme poverty. And we have, and I'm going to finish with this, a standards initiative. We have a commitment in the ILO to ensure that our body of international labour conventions responds effectively to changing conditions in the world of work. And I've tried to say something about those changing conditions. The workers' group has agreed with the employers and the governments to set in motion in the coming years a standards review mechanism which will subject existing ILO conventions to review to see which of those remain adequate, suitable to current conditions, those which might need to be revised, and new conventions that might need to be adopted to address upcoming issues. It's a big, big deal. President, I'm going to finish with that, except to say one more thing. If we take the view that we live in a world of work which is being radically transformed at a pace and at a depth which we probably haven't seen before, and not always in ways which are to the advantage of working people, it strikes me that we have to look at ourselves. You know, for organisations which dream of changing the world, we're not always particularly good at changing ourselves. And that includes the ILO. And the ILO, since I've been in the job, and it's 2.5 years now, has undertaken a process of change and reform. We're trying to make our influence more widely felt. That can only be based upon an upgrading of our own analytical and technical capacities. If I want the ILO to go to the G20, and we have a seat in the G20, and sometimes do battle with the World Banks and the IMFs and the OECDs, it won't be on the basis of our values, important as they are. It would also be on the basis of the quality and the persuasiveness of the technical analytical work that we do. So we've worked extremely hard to make this organisation more effective in that regard, and I think we're getting somewhere. I also want the ILO to be in the difficult places. I want the ILO to be present where tough decisions are being made, not to shy away from them, but to be there. And I think that's reflected in what we've done in Bangladesh since the Rana Plaza tragedy of April 2013. We were there 1 week after the Rana Plaza collapse took place. We're engaged with a number of your Global Union Federation colleagues in engaging the industry in amelioration processes. We're helping the Bangladeshis to create a labour inspectorate. We're pushing them to reform their labour legislation. We're doing it. We're also present in the crisis countries of Southern Europe. We've established an office in Greece. We've been engaged with the Greek government. We've been engaged with the international organisations in Greece. And these put us in tough positions. These put us in the middle of major controversies. And I think the ILO has to be ready to take the heat in those situations.